I'm going to hit record. We are recording, so this will be on YouTube, the Becoming an Outdoors Woman playlist to go along with the other 4 classes that we did. And tonight we are going to talk about field dressing, transportation, CWD, all kinds of things. So, we're kind of finishing out our class, talking about kind of the end of your hunt and what happens. So let me get this up here. You guys see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I think most of you have been with us for the whole series, which is amazing, but I'm Sarah Smith. I'm the Becoming an Outdoors Woman program coordinator based in Helena. And Laura, who has been with us on all of these, I think if she gets on, she'll be here a little late because she was traveling. And Jessie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Jessie Gudgel. I work with the Aquatic Invasive Species Bureau out of Helena.
Yeah, and then our guest speaker tonight is Danielle, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Euler. I'm the Wildlife Stewardship Outreach Specialist, and I do work with human-wildlife conflict and wildlife stewardship issues across the state, and particularly lately with bears. So we'll be talking about some handling carcasses and bear country.
Yes, wonderful. And Jessie, if you can just keep an eye on the participants, and if Laura comes in, you should be able to add her as a panelist.
Okay.
Do that. That'd be great because I just can't see it from this view. So awesome. So let's jump into it. So yeah, this is after the hunt. So field dressing, transportation, CWD, and if you don't know what that means, we will be telling you, and processing. So this is a really important part. You've done all this prep work, you've got all this gear, you've done all your research and homework, you've gone out and you've actually got an animal down. So we like to say, or at least I like to say, this is when the real work starts, right? But you put in a lot of work up to this point, and you're going to put in a little more. So with field dressing, so you are out in the field, you shot your animal, and we didn't talk about this at the last class, but something that we always tell people, and it's just a good practice, instead of, you're super excited, you want to go see your animal, you need to wait. And we kind of tell people about 30 minutes because it can take a long time for an elk or a deer or even an antelope to actually die after you've shot it. And so sometimes they'll drop, and that doesn't always mean that they're dead. And so if you get impatient and you rush up to that animal and it hasn't completely finished dying, it can jump up and take off. And it's unbelievable how far these animals can go, even with a lethal shot. Elk are very strong, powerful animals. They can run a really long way before they actually lay down and die. So if you spook them and they take off, then you have just put yourself in a pretty bad situation where you're going to be having to go find that animal, or you might lose that animal. So it's just really important, as hard as it is, because you've got that adrenaline pumping. If you know you made a good shot, and especially if you can see where the animal is, just wait. Even if you can't see where the animal is, try to wait before you try to start tracking and looking for a blood trail. I've shot deer before, and I'm like, oh, they took off. Like, I'm going to wait. And then I walk over there, and like 2 feet, like there's a little hill, and they're just right there waiting for me. So, but again, just be patient so that your animal doesn't jump up and take off on you. Approach from behind, and you might think that's a weird thing to say, but again, if your animal hasn't totally died yet, I've heard of people getting antlers to the face because that animal's jumped up and the people are like right down there looking at it. And so I've always, taken a stick or something, and like they say to poke it in the eye, and if it blinks, it hasn't died yet, but just something to be careful of. And even at that point, I mean, I kind of stand there and watch, because again, even if you come up from behind, you could get kicked. And I've heard of people getting kicked. So just something to be aware of so that you don't get hurt before you start field dressing. If it's in muddy or boggy areas, just try to pull it up onto kind of higher, cleaner ground, because we're going to talk a lot about keeping your meat clean and how important that is. So if you're in kind of a icky, swampy area, try to find a clean, as dry as possible place for you to do the field dressing. Wearing gloves, we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's a few reasons why we do it. One is just to help with cleanup, because it can be a bit of a messy business. CWD and other wildlife diseases is also part of that. And then something, I'm not sure if any of you are thinking about it, but taxidermy. So some people, especially if they get, really nice elk or a nice buck deer, they might want to have it mounted, have the head taxidermy or whole body or whatever. And there's a very specific way you have to skin out a deer or cape it so that the taxidermist can actually do that for you. So think about that. If you know that you want to, have the head taxidermied of your first deer, you're going to need to be prepared to cape it out the right way. Because if you don't, I don't think they can do it at certain points if you cut in places that you shouldn't have. And then, are you going to eat the organs? That's a question that you need to think about. Do you want the heart and the liver? Just something to keep in mind when you decide what way you're going to field dress your animal. So, do you have any other tips there, Jessie?
No, I think you did a really good job covering those. When we talk about, waiting for your animal, we talk a lot about rifle hunting in here, but that is especially true if you're doing archery hunting. There's just, there's, like she said, use a stick, poke the little bugger in the eye. That sounds mean, but I would rather you poke the bugger in the eye and see it blink and wait longer than, like she said, get a face full of antlers or a hoof to the body somehow. They are surprisingly strong animals, and they have a ton of adrenaline when something happens, and just be very careful. A little to add to that is, you guys probably in the news every year you hear more and more that, hey, that rifle shot, that was a dinner bell for a bear. So as you're waiting, be very aware of your surroundings, look and see if there's anything coming into it. And we'll again talk more about that later, but just don't forget, after your animal's down, you still have to pay attention to your surroundings.
Yeah, definitely. And other hunters in the area as well. It's important to kind of, if you see other hunters, I've heard weird, crazy stories about people that were shooting at the same elk, and then they both find it, and then they get into a fight over who actually shot the elk. So just kind of being aware and paying attention to that kind of stuff is important for sure. Okay, so here's a great picture for after dinner. This is a picture of somebody gutting a deer, and I say gutting because we're going to talk about gutting and gutless method. And so this is a pretty clean looking picture, actually. And I am going to preface this with saying that while I have been hunting like for my whole life, basically, I am extremely allergic to deer hair, to the point where I can't field dress my own animal. So while I have been a part of it for every deer that I've taken, I've never been able to get up close and personal like this because of my allergies. But I've been taught how to do it, even if I haven't been able to do it myself. So Jessie, of course, will also bring in her perspective and information. But just as far as informationally, there's gutting, which is literally removing those organs. It helps cool the meat pretty quickly. And again, if you want to eat the heart and the liver and things, you're going to have to pretty much do this method. You're basically slitting all the way up that deer and removing all of those organs, blood, things like that, which does help cool the carcass a lot faster. You do have to have a bit of a strong stomach and kind of a mindset, because it can be pretty, I'm not going to say, well, maybe a little bit shocking the first time. There's some smells, there's some noises, there's some blood. There's a lot going on in there. So it's just something to know that the first couple of times, even, it might be pretty uncomfortable. and you might not be expecting some of the things that you'll be smelling or hearing, but it's just part of hunting and it's part of taking care of your meat. So it's really important to get in there and get the job done. The gutless method, and I personally have never done this, but it depends on kind of where you're hunting, how quickly you need to get meat out, how much you can pack, or are you close enough to, gut this in the field and take the whole carcass back with you. But you're actually leaving the internal organs inside the body, and you're basically just taking the quarters, and there's a way to cut in for the loins. You're not gonna be able to get the organs really with this method. But the other thing is, we'll talk a lot about waste to game, and there's a law about what you have to take, but there's usually way more meat on a deer than what you legally have to take. So in this gutless method, you might not be really getting as much meat as you could, because there's ribs, there's neck meat, there's all kinds of other meat that you could potentially be missing that while you're legally not required to take, if you're hunting for the meat, you want to collect as much as you can. So there's pros and cons to both of those methods. You kind of have to work quickly because you're not cooling off that carcass by removing those organs. So obviously we can't show you how to do this, unfortunately, but there's a lot of really good YouTube videos on both of these methods. I think the best one I've seen on the gutless, he does it in under 10 minutes, an elk, a cow elk in under 10 minutes. So there's some really, really good videos that I would highly encourage you to watch, because they're going to get up close and personal, talking to you about where you want to cut, what you want to pay attention to, what you want to puncture or not puncture. You don't want to puncture the gut or the stomach, things like that. So there's a lot of nuance that goes into it. But, once you kind of can get up close and personal and see it, you'll really understand the process. And if you can go with somebody that knows what they're doing, that have field dressed a lot of animals, that's great. Please practice with them. Otherwise, just try to watch as much YouTube as possible. And you can even print out like step-by-step instructions if you wanted to take them with you to reference. Something you might notice when you start watching, people have preferences on how they gut out a deer. It's not the same for everybody. Some people might start here or there, use a saw or use a knife, or people all just have their preferences like anything else. So don't get confused when you see people doing it differently, but find what works best for you. And again, you've done all this work, you've got this animal, you really need to take care of the meat. It's so important because it can spoil pretty quickly. And right off the bat, depending on how you shoot that animal, we really stress good shot placement, getting out to the range and practicing so you can make a quick, clean kill. The other important thing with shot placement is wasting meat, because if you shoot a deer like smack on in the shoulder or something like that, you can get what's called bloodshot. And I guess the best way to describe it is just that bullet is impacting the bone and the meat, and it's basically kind of ruining that chunk of meat. So when you start skinning and looking at the meat, there might be bone fragments, and it'll be just it just looks pretty gross, and you probably shouldn't be eating it. So, depending on where you're shooting and what caliber of gun you're using, you might lose a whole quarter or shoulder. And that's a lot of meat to lose. You definitely have to, try to cut around it. But if it's to that point, you can't eat it. It's not technically waste to game, although, again, you've worked really hard for this. So you definitely want to try to get as much meat as possible. So keep that in mind when you're doing shot placement. You might hear people refer to gut shot, and that's pretty much just what it sounds. Somebody makes a bad shot, shoots it through the gut. It can rupture all kinds of things, release all kind of nasty stuff in there. It's not a pretty picture when you get into the meat. So those are instances where your shot placement directly affects the amount of meat that you'll be harvesting from the animal.
I think those are all really good points. I just want to again say that is a very, very, very clean picture. Maybe they call me Messy Jessie for a reason, but I have never had an animal look that clean when I'm trying to gut it.
And on the snow, that's impressive.
And on the snow, right.
Yeah.
And like this picture, that's not exactly how I do it. Even when I'm gutting, I do bigger cuts and I have, more stuff splayed open, but like she said, you'll find your own way that you do it. And I change my way depending on where I am. So if it's a mucky, gross area, I'll probably just yank the guts out and drag it somewhere. If I'm close to the vehicle, I'll just drag it all the way out. If I have to pack the meat a long ways, I will typically go the gutless method. So I don't necessarily just use one way. It kind of depends on a lot of things for my situation. Another thing that, Sarah was talking about is there's going to be things that are surprising to you, like she said, smell, sounds. These gut piles, especially on an elk or a moose or some of those bigger animals, are immensely huge. You will be amazed how big and how heavy they are. If you're on a slope, use that slope to your advantage and like pull it off to the side and let it, gravity help you out. It is a lot slipperier in there than you expect, even though you kind of go, oh yeah, it's going to be slippery. Like your grip is strange. I mean, take some rags with you and help grab onto, like if you pull the esophagus out and stuff like that. Most people, at least once or twice, no matter how careful they are, they're going to perforate the guts when they're trying to gut something. If you do that, know that, oh, before I start cutting on the meat, now I've got all these feces on my knife, you're probably going to wash that knife off. If you get the guts somehow perforated and it gets on the meat, just be aware you're going to need to clean that meat sooner than later. Wipe it off as best you can. If there's snow, use the snow to wipe it off. Just really, really be aware. So it's not the end of the world if it happens, but just understand that you need to take care of that as soon as you can.
Time is of the essence when you are dealing with the meat. So we're just going to go through these really quickly. Just some of the things that you want to think about having, depending on how you're going to take it out. Game bags, if you're going to be, boning it out or taking out quarters, things like that. A sharp knife is super, super important, worth investing in.
Multiple sharp knives
or knife sharpener. Find one that works for you. It doesn't have to be like this, but just make sure that you are comfortable with it and you know how it locks, if it folds and locks. A saw, they didn't use one in the last picture, I don't think, but some people will split the breastbone so they have little saws that you can like get up in there and do that. Again, gloves, just again for cleanup. When it's cold, it's nice not to have like all that stuff on your hands if you have gloves on. Water, specifically for cleaning you and your meat, and your tag. And we talked about that a lot, but you have to make sure you have the license or tag with you to make sure that you can notch it out when you take that animal. So make sure you have that. And then transportation. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
Some people I know that, when I was a kid, my family would pull out these huge like calving gloves. As much as you might giggle at people with those, it is so nice because like I said, I get bloody up to my shoulders basically when I'm trying to get guts out. So having those all the way up is so nice. I don't get my shirt all bloody. I don't get all itchy because blood tends to make me really itchy, all that kind of stuff. So you don't necessarily, the small gloves are great, but if you can find those big ones, they can be super awesome.
Yeah, and you can, I think like Murdoch's, those kinds of stores, calving gloves, you don't know what they are. They come like really high. So you take those off and you're clean and ready to go on your way. Transportation wise, again, it depends on where you're hunting and how far back you are, but you might have a game cart or a sled, a drag rope that you can hook on and literally drag it out of there. A friend is super great to help you pack out your meat. If you share it, they'll probably help you, especially those bigger animals. It's really nice to have a friend or a horse or something like that. Some kind of backpack with a frame if you're going to be way out and just needing to pack quarters back, things like that. Again, some game bags just to help with that process. And then quickly, evidence of sex. So this law has changed just in the last few years. They used to always tell you it had to be attached to the carcass, and now it just needs to be with the carcass. So evidence of sex, obviously, if it has antlers or horns, that's a way to do that. But otherwise, you need to be aware that when you're field dressing, you need to be able to prove the sex, because your tag is for a certain bull or doe or whatever it might be. And if a game warden stops you, they're going to want to see that you have the right animal for the right tag. So I won't keep this up here that long. You're welcome to look it up again or come back and watch this, but just know that you do need to take that into account when you're field dressing, especially if you leave stuff out in the field. If you leave the gut pile out in the field, just make sure you have some evidence of sex attached. Okay, so we're going to jump over to Danielle, because Montana and bears, we have them. People more often than not can run into problems with bears, because you're cutting open animals, there's blood, there's meat, especially if you're out and you're hanging meat in trees and you're camping and things like that. So Danielle is going to just chat with us about how to be bear aware when we're hunting and packing out meat.
Thanks, Sarah. So a couple of things just to start off. I hope that this information just makes you feel a little bit more prepared, and it doesn't scare you from hunting in places where there are bears, because in Montana we have bears, black bears in most of the state and grizzly bears, and you could see them anywhere west of Billings, although some places you're a lot more likely to see them than others. And the reason that we are at odds and have a higher likelihood of encountering bears during hunting season is because, well, during the hunt, we're quiet and we're sneaking around, and we can't do all the things to let bears know we're coming. But then once we have a carcass on the ground, a carcass is a huge attractant for a bear. And that's their whole goal in the fall when we have our hunting season, is for them to get as much food as they can, but to prepare for winter. So they're going through hyperphagia is the name of that physiological change. So there's a couple things you can think of as you're going through your hunt. And like, if you get an animal on the ground, and I can tell you, I grew up in the Gardner area and started hunting as an adult, but in that area, and it like really hits you when an animal's on the ground and you're in grizzly country, you're like, oh, okay, now it's real. So you really want to think ahead a little bit about how you're going to manage this and what you're going to do with that carcass. So first of all, it's a little bit different depending on if you're, pretty far in the back country, or you're close enough to get to your car in one trip, or your truck. So you're going to take time to think ahead about how you're going to handle that carcass. If you're in an area, with a lot of bear activity, I would exercise caution in taking a shot at the end of the day. And I'm sure, as you learned from Sarah and other speakers earlier in this series, an animal doesn't always die, right, the first time you shoot it. And you may end up having to track it. And you don't want to have to track an animal on a blood trail in the dark in bear country if you can avoid it, especially if you've recently seen bear activity, or you have reason to think that there's bears, close by, especially. So that's something to consider as you're looking at if you're going to take a shot, or where you're hunting and what time of day you're hunting. One thing that we've done in our backcountry camps is that we go in the day before, we set up the camp, our tent is ready to go, like a wall tent, and we have a bear hang already set up, so that if during the day that from that camp where we're hunting, we bring stuff back, we have a place to store it already to go. Because it's not good to have to do that in the dark, again, hanging up stuff in the tree, because it's kind of hard to find a good branch necessarily when you're out there, like in a kind of a not ideal situation. So the biggest thing you can do is just get the carcass either stored properly or out of the backcountry as soon as you can. Now, I know that not every situation is perfect, and you can't always get an animal out of the backcountry or close enough to your rig to get it out in one trip, much less before dark. So just do it as quickly as you can safely. If you have to leave an animal on the ground, there's some things to consider there. So first of all, don't leave a carcass in bear country near a trail. Like, you don't want somebody else to go in and then they're walking in, say, whether it's in the dark or not, and a bear finds that carcass, and then they could be guarding that carcass from somebody else that's walking through. So you want to think safety. Same reason you wouldn't want to shoot an animal like near someone's camp. So same idea here. But if you can't and you have to leave it on the ground, you want to leave it. If you can move it somewhere where you can see it from a little bit of a ways away, so that if you're having to come back the next day, you have a good view of it. You can see if an animal has disturbed the carcass, if there's a bear on the carcass. When you come back, we'll talk more about this. It's always good to just really, if you can come back with your friends, like we talked about first, like having other people to go with you, that's key. Another tip I got from a coworker here at FWP is that he actually sticks a stick in the rib cage of the animal if he has to leave the carcass whole on the ground. And you can even go another step by adding like flagging or something to it so that you can see it better. And one of the signature things with bears is when they find a carcass, they'll often like roll it over or move it around when they're feeding on it. So if you have a stick stuck in the rib cage and you come back and it's in the same exact position, it's a lot less likely. You can pretty safely assume a bear hasn't claimed that carcass, whereas maybe a bird has found something, but there's not a bear on it. Another thing you can do is you can separate, if possible, separate the gut pile from the carcass itself. And what this does is particularly if you have the opportunity with the terrain to move the meat that you plan to keep or most of the carcass upwind of the gut pile, the idea here is that a bear, if they smell the carcass, they're going to come into that gut pile first and feed on it, and then leave your meat that you want to come back and get untouched. Hopefully that's the idea there, if you have to leave it on the ground. So that's another thing you can do. You can also just, be planning to come back, even if it's not the most convenient way, come back in a way you can see it from far away with other people and making a lot of noise. So the reason we say this is because obviously you're not hunting anymore. You're just coming back to get the meat. You're not worried about scaring anything. And if a bear for some reason has claimed that carcass, they usually aren't going to back off of it. So they'll, you'll be aware of them. Like they'll come out to like guard it or something if they've claimed it, rather than like you quietly walking in and then you're talking with your friends and you're working on the animal and the bear was sleeping nearby and they didn't know you were there until you're on the animal. So the idea with making noise is to give them a heads up. If you're lucky enough, I've never had this opportunity, but if you have horses and you can approach a carcass on horseback, bears are less likely to challenge people on horseback than people on foot. So again, that's not everybody's situation, but if you have the opportunity, that's good. Something else to know is you should never haze a bear off a carcass. You should never try to take the carcass back from the bear because once they have it, they're very unlikely to relinquish it. But also, let's say you do get the bear off the carcass, then it's just like pacing around and trying to find an opportunity to claim it back again. And you're kind of like battling with this animal. And don't try it in any case, doesn't matter the species, but particularly like a grizzly bear, you're not going to win that. We know from Yellowstone, just like in a natural setting like of Yellowstone Park, we know that when grizzly bears show up on a carcass that wolves have killed, they steal it 80% of the time from wolves. So they don't really see us as much of a challenge, compared to other animals that they deal with in their daily lives. Another nice thing to have when you're gutting and just thinking about bear country is that you have your bear spray handy and on your person. And if you have a couple people there that someone else, again, this is really variable depending on like how much bear activity there is in an area, but it's nice when you're in a place that there are a lot of bears that somebody else could kind of be watching around and making noise and just kind of paying attention to what's going on around you. Something else just to know about bears and their habits if they get food, like a carcass, is that they may bed nearby. So again, you may not actually see them, but if it's in the heat of the day, they're often sleeping nearby if they've already gotten their fill, if they've started to feed on that. And if you ever come back and you see that the carcass you left has been like really moved or partially buried, those are signs of bear activity particularly. So don't even try to mess with it. Just get out of the area, make sure you have a location, call a game warden and like let them know what happened so that they can go investigate. Cause there's a possibility, depending on what happened, that you could get your tag reissued or something if the bear stole your carcass. So don't try to challenge them. And again, this really varies depending on where you're hunting and how many bears are in the area. So some places don't have many bears at all. Some places you see sign everywhere you go. So it really varies a lot. I'm just kind of giving you the perspective of hunting in the heavy bear country, like places that you really expect that they're going to be around. And I heard you guys mention earlier about, is the sound of a gunshot a dinner bell? Well, most of the time in Montana, that's not the case, but it has been documented in certain areas of the state where there are a real high concentration of hunters, elk, and grizzly bears, where we have had some bears realize that when somebody shoots their gun, there could be a carcass. So they go towards it to investigate. Again, doesn't mean they're going to try to push you off, but some places in the state that has happened. So I don't say that to scare you. I just want to be transparent that that's a possibility. Bears are super intelligent animals, and it's like just like dog training, right? Like the sound, the reward, the association. But I would say, everything in life has a risk, and hunting, inherently there are risks that go along with it. And in hunting in bear country, there are more risks as well, but you just have to decide for yourself what's within your risk tolerance. And for me, I mean, it's part of like, I've become very used to it because of where I live. I'm down in Livingston, and pretty much everywhere south of us and where I grew up in Gardner, we have grizzly bears all over the place. So that's normal to me. It may not be in your comfort zone. Just do what's comfortable for you, and just, try to think about those food sources and your behavior and your preventative measures from the perspective of what you can do to prevent it and what the bear might perceive the situation like. So if you guys have questions or specifics you're wondering about for handling carcasses, hanging, by the way, I'd mentioned hanging. If you're going to hang meat, hang it 10 feet off the ground at least, and 4 feet from the supporting trees, so that a bear can't climb up and get it. Because honestly, I'm not sure hanging quarters 2 feet off the ground is any better than just having it on the ground, other than it's getting cooled off more, because honestly, it's just more visible to them, and it probably carries the scent further. But the cleanliness is important, and the cooling of the meat is important. So there's a lot to consider. Don't let it overwhelm you. It's all part of learning. So that's why we're here. Do you guys have any questions about that, or things that are unclear, or anything that I could clarify?
You guys feel free to put those in the Q&A if you do. I'm curious, Danielle, how far away from where you hang your meat do you camp? Do you have like a certain footage that you go by?
Yeah, that's really important, actually. So on Forest Service lands, and as a general rule, it's a guideline elsewhere, that you should be 100 yards, which is a football field distance, between carcasses, even if they're stored properly, and any attractants, like even if it's your food for your camp and you have it hung up in a tree properly, you should still be 100 yards away from that when you're sleeping. And the reason for that being that then if a bear does come in because they smell it, because just because it's hung up in a tree doesn't mean they know that they can't get it. They're still possibly going to come sniff around. Then you're far enough away. You're not likely to be in the path that they're taking to go check it out. And hopefully you've stored it properly. They smell around, but they can't get it, and they go on their way. And that's the ideal situation. And if it makes you feel any better, I've spent a lot of time in grizzly country. I've hiked thousands of miles of trails and slept over 150 nights on the ground in grizzly bear country. And I've never been concerned about my personal safety, like a life or death situation. I've been scared a few times, but nothing like, I would say, life threatening. So this is really rare, and you can do a lot to prevent it.
Yeah, just being aware of it and having your bear spray, it's huge. It'll go a long way. So
yeah, then thank you for mentioning that, bear spray, and have it somewhere accessible, like really easy to get to. Mm-hmm. I carry it during hunting season. I carry mine on my binocular harness, or often on my right hip on my waist belt of my backpack. So yeah, it's a really good tool to have.
Awesome. Well, Danielle, will you be able to hang around till the end if we have more questions?
Yeah, I can hang around.
Cool. So yeah, you guys think about that. And again, pop any questions in the Q&A that you might have, but I'll jump back into the PowerPoint here. Again, it's just something, I mean, you guys see it. You guys see it in the, hold on, why is this? I'm sure you've seen it in the news. I mean, you know, we're out and about at the same time, looking for food at the same time. So it's just something that you got to be aware of. The next thing we're going to talk about, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail, is, hold on, I'm going to stop this and jump to our website, is CWD. And that is chronic wasting disease. And it's something that we didn't have to really deal with for a long time in Montana. And just, gosh, it's only been a few years now that we have had to deal with it in Montana. So it's a pretty nasty deal. And it's something that, you know, when it first hit, we kind of were like, how are we going to manage this? We've come up with a lot of ways to do that. And there is a lot of information, as you can see, on our FWP website. There's video about how to take samples. And the reason that we talk about sampling, even though it's never been shown to affect people eating it, it's still, the Centers for Disease Control still recommend that if you have a CWD positive deer, that you don't consume it. So, which is a big bummer. I had my first experience with it the year before last. I made my parents and we all got our deer sampled. We've never done it before. And my dad's came back positive. So it was the first CWD positive in the area that we hunt in, which was a really big bummer, because that means obviously it's been there, or it's been around there. And we had, you know, we chose to dispose of the meat. So that was one deer that we did not eat because of CWD. My husband shot one in a field right across from where my dad's was, and his tested negative. So it's kind of the luck of the draw. Chronic wasting disease, you can't always tell a sick deer. It's degenerative. It takes some time to actually kill the animal. And it's something that you need to be aware of, because a lot of us want to, you know, we're hunting because we want meat. And this is a factor in if we're probably going to eat it or not. So again, some people don't have any issues with it. They don't get their deer tested. They just eat it, and like they've always done. But again, we just want to make people really aware of it, and that the CDC does say you shouldn't eat it. So I'm not going to go into a lot of this information, but there are things you need to consider when you're transporting the meat, how to dispose of the carcass. I believe it's just in landfills now, or you can leave it out in the, you know, where you shot it. But just ways to try to prevent it from spreading. It can spread pretty easily in a lot of different ways. And but we can do our part to try to keep it from spreading even more. But as you can see, there's a ton of FAQs, but they're really good. I would suggest you take the time to kind of go through these and look at them, read them, and just be aware it's on the landscape now. And it's just another thing as hunters that we need to be aware of. So that's about as much as I'm going to talk about CWD, because we could spend like days talking about CWD and where it came from, and, you know, what it does, and like and all that. But I just want everyone to be aware of it, and, you know, why people are testing and things like that. So as far as transportation goes, you definitely want to keep your meat clean, cool, and dry. So moisture, dirt, heat, it can all spoil your meat really quickly. And again, we've gone through a lot of work for this, so we don't want to have it all spoil before we can eat it. Hanging it, some people will hang their meat. And again, it's going to depend on the temperature, the time of year you're hunting. You know, sometimes in late October, we can have 80-degree days. So probably not the best time to hang the meat. We'll talk a little bit more about why people do that. But if you are going to do a CWD sample of your game, it's best if you can freeze it, or, you know, if you're going to be able to hang it in cold temperatures, but you're going to want to wait to get that sample back before you start eating it or even butchering it. I would wait if you can, so you don't butcher it all and have it wrapped up so nice and have a positive. So if you can wait, it was taking them 2 to 3 weeks last time, because they are getting a ton of samples. And on that website, it does talk about how you can send in a sample yourself. You can also take it to an FWP office to get it sampled. Game check stations that you might drive through can help you take a sample, and you go on the website and check out, you get a number and check out the results. And if it's positive, you get a phone call like my dad did from a biologist to chat with you about that. Again, this is this waste of game law. So, if you take all the meat and then you forget it in the back of your truck for a day and it's 80 degrees, that's waste of game. You just wasted an entire truck full of meat by letting it spoil in the back of your truck. Jesse, his husband, is a game warden, and he said he runs into this one quite a bit because people aren't taking care of their meat properly. So again, we want to respect the animal that we harvested and use the meat as much as we possibly can. And you can get really creative. People smoke the ribs, they use the bones for bone broth. So it's not just those super lovely loins and quarters that you can use. You can use a lot of the animal for sure. So processing, so that aging meat, that hanging meat, if you have the facilities to do it, obviously, if you're going to hang a whole deer and elk, you have to have somewhere to do it. Again, only wanting to do it if it's cold enough outside to keep the meat from spoiling. People say that it helps kind of tenderize the meat and age the meat, depending on, if you shoot a really old, stinky mule deer buck, you might want to age it for a little longer than if you shoot something kind of young whitetail that, was probably going to taste a little better anyway. But that's something to consider, aging your meat. You don't have to do it. Sometimes if you're going to take it to a processing plant or a butcher, that they might be able to do it for you. But that's just one thing to consider when you're going to the processing phase. The next one is, are you going to do it yourself? Are you going to invest in a grinder to grind a burger? A lot of people, cut up steaks and they have the loins and then they'll process a lot of it into hamburger. It can be a bit of an investment if you want to buy a grinder, but think of all the other fun stuff that you can make with a grinder. And, if you shoot an elk and you just have a home freezer, you're going to be in trouble. There's so much meat on these animals. So you need to make sure you have enough storage. We bought a chest freezer as soon as, we had a place to put it, because my parents were storing all our meat in theirs. There's just so much. If a couple people shoot a couple deer, or you get an elk, there's a lot of meat that you're going to be needing to store. The other thing you can do is take it to a professional meat processor. And a couple things to keep in mind when you do this. Some places you probably should ask, and if this matters to you, but it's called batch processing. So if I take a deer in and Jesse takes a deer in, we might not get our deer, or each, I might get part of Jesse's deer and she might get part of mine, because they're processing everything in big batches. So they're just processing all the meat together and you're getting the pounds back that you brought in. And so if I take care of my meat really well and it's very clean and I took care of it and brought it in, and Jessie didn't take care of her meat very well and it's kind of gross, they still might process it together. So it's something that you just want to be aware of. If it doesn't, it might not matter and they might still do a really good job or not like take meat that's not so great. But with CWD as well, there's some processing things that the places need to consider. I think they have to wait for a sample, or if there was a sample, they have to wait for to get that back. So there's some stuff there. Again, I heard about one that they batch processed a bunch of deer and then one of them had come back CWD positive, and everyone's meat that had been put in with that batch was considered tainted. So,
and that's a good point, Sarah. I mean, when you think about this, especially, during hunting season, these places are inundated with meat. So it's probably not 1 or 2 deer. It's probably 30 deer that they've weighed, and you get the same weight back, but it's probably parts of 30 deer.
Yeah.
Which is not always a bad thing.
Not always a bad thing, but just something to be aware of. Yeah. And places that don't batch process, you might end up waiting a lot longer. So one of the places, if my parents take things, to get like fancy jerky or sausage or things made, they might wait till January to get their meat back because they're doing them like animal by animal instead of batch processing. So that's another thing to consider, is that they are inundated with meat and there's not as many meat processors out there as there were. And you might be waiting a long time if they're doing them individually. And I always ask around about the reputation that they have, just to make sure that they're pretty reputable. They're going to take care of your meat. They're not going to short you, just, it's a business. So do your homework like you would any other business before you give them your money and your meat. But yeah, just ask around, see if people are taking new customers. Some places are so busy that they might not accept, you might drive up with your deer and be like, here I am. And they'll be like, sorry, we're not taking any more carcasses. And then what are you going to do? So it's just good to do your homework and research before you do take it to a processor.
And again, everything's on YouTube.
Yeah.
You can find anything online. So don't be afraid to try it yourself. It's not as scary as a lot of people think it is.
Yeah. And especially if you're just going to cut a lot of roast and steaks and things like that, you might not even need a grinder. You might just, have your roast and your steaks and your loins and some meat for jerky or something. So yeah, you don't have to go, again, it's preference on how you like to eat the venison and prepare it. So yeah, it doesn't have to be a super expensive endeavor to do. Pinterest is great. Lots of recipes on Pinterest. And again, get creative, try to use as much of the animal as possible. We have a video on the Bow Facebook page of one of our instructors making venison bone broth. So it's just another way to get the most out of your animal. So yeah, before you start, kind of plan out your cuts, decide, am I buying a grinder and making most of this into hamburger? Am I going to do roast? What will you eat? What will your family eat? Knowing that will really help you prepare. If you are going to grind a lot of burger, some people add fat in because it just makes it a little easier to work with, easier to cook. The kind of fat is up to you and the quantity, and everyone has their own ratio. And is it bacon or is it suet or is it pork shoulder? So again, a lot of personal preference involved. Are you going to buy a vacuum sealer or just double wrap it, which is, saran wrap, wax paper, wrap it up, freeze it. You can get really cool little game bags that you can put your ground burger in. That works really well for ground burger. It looks kind of like what you might get at the store in some places. And then just remembering that venison is a very low fat meat. And so you really need to cook it with care and make sure that you're not overcooking it, because you can overcook venison super fast. They're not
nearly as good.
Yeah, might not be so good. Yeah, after that happens. But so again, tons of resources online, tons of recipes. I just threw these up here. These are just a couple things, my go-tos. I love doing stir fry with venison. I make a ton of jerky. Don't be me. Don't use your loin, which is like the gold, people call it. I used a loin to make jerky once and my dad nearly disowned me. So usually you want to save kind of those tougher or, other cuts for that kind of stuff. But yeah, these are just some places that you can go to find some recipes. So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. I know it was a ton of content. I'm going to have more content, bonus content coming up. A video about field dressing equipment, stuff you need in your vehicle while you're hunting, and even some sausage making and how to do that, walking it through with one of the instructors that helped with our gear episode. So we are going to have more content coming. Again, you can always reach out to me if you have any questions or need some more resources or just anything. If you have more questions after this series is over, please reach out and let me know. Happy to help you however I can to make sure that you have a really good hunting experience. And hopefully in the next few weeks, I'll have time to edit all this footage and get it together, and I'll put it on YouTube and our Facebook page and everything. So yeah, that was a ton of information, I know. Jesse, was there anything extra before we jump into questions that people might have?
The only little tidbit I have is, I've met a lot of people who haven't hunted, but they thought they might like game meat, and they're like, oh no, it's really weird. It tastes funny. I don't like it. And what I found is if we feed it to them, if we've cooked it well, they're like, oh, this is really good. Is this beef? We're like, no, it's not beef. It tastes wrong, right? They're like, yeah, but it's good. A lot of people, if they don't like game meat, it's because it has not been cared for properly. Making sure it cools down quickly. You don't get all those weird cooties growing in there. Making sure it's very clean is all those things really do add into a good end product. So it's very important that you do take care of the meat properly. Like Sarah said so many times, we've put the work into it. Let's make sure that we follow it through with how we care for it after the fact. And it's a great meat. It's a great adventure, and it's just it's a really cool thing, but make sure you follow through on it.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Or Danielle, do you have a favorite recipe or way that you prepare your venison?
Oh gosh. I've tried doing neck roast, which I actually think are pretty cool. Once that I knew it was not CWD positive. And then one thing I tried this year, okay, a couple of things. One thing is I tried a ham, like you'd cure a ham from a pork ham, but I did it on a front quarter of a deer, and it was really like an amazing combination of like ham flavor and deer, which doesn't sound appealing, but it was really good. And then one thing I will say that the hard lesson I learned as an adult hunter beginning and not knowing what I was doing is I used to try to like clean all the little bits of meat out of the shanks. Just don't do that. Just like store them whole and like slow cook them, and they'll become one of your favorite parts. And then you won't spend hours like trying to separate the tendon away from the tiny little pieces of meat. So
Yeah.
It's a great tip.
Looks like we have a question. Taxidermy. Yeah, so I am not an expert in that. You can look that up online. They have specific ways you need to cut the hide depending on how much you're gonna, like if you're gonna do like a neck mount. Some people, obviously if you're just gonna do like a European mount with just the antlers or the skull, you don't have to worry about it so much, but they have places where you can usually like they'll have beetles eat off all the stuff on the skull, so you can put that up. But I would look for taxidermists in your area and ask them how they want it done, because again, I think it probably could be some preference on how they're going to mount it. You should also ask about cost. It's expensive. And it can take a really long time. It might be a year before you get the mount back. So just kind of be aware of that. But I can't speak exactly to how you cape it out, but definitely reach out to taxidermists in your area and ask how they'd prefer to have it done. Or if you can bring it to them, if you're able to take the entire animal out after you field dressed it, just up to a certain point. And honestly, in that photo, now that I'm thinking about it, that might be why he didn't come up and split so high, because he might be caping that animal out for a mount. So ask if you can, bring it to them from a certain point and they can cape it out for you so that they have what they need to mount the animal.
And a good point, Sarah, is just that, different animals, if you have ideas on what you're going to do with a certain, like if you're going for a mountain goat, and that you're going to want to do a full body mount, obviously you're going to want to skin that differently than if it's just a head mount. So it's important to kind of have an idea of what you want to do in order to ask the taxidermist, because they're going to be like, what do you want?
Yeah, some of those like once in a lifetime animals, some people will do an entire animal. So it's definitely different depending on how you choose to do it. You can also just put the horns on like those little do it yourself. They look like a little shield, and you can have a nice little antler mount as well. So that's just an option too. And then you don't have to worry so much about keeping an animal out, but just a consideration, because I think especially new folks don't think about it. And especially if it's a first animal and it's a really nice buck or an elk, they might want to preserve that memory with a mount, and then they don't think about it ahead of time, and then they might ruin the cape and then they can't get what they want. So Anything else that you guys have for us? I really appreciate everyone sticking with us through the whole series. I hope it's been helpful. Otherwise, we will be ending on time tonight. Anything else you'd like to add, Danielle, just as someone who came into this as an adult?
No, I'm just excited for you guys because, I thought I knew a lot about nature, and like being in the woods and hunting really like opened up a different way of seeing the natural world that I'd never experienced. And I think it's just exciting that you guys are going to get to see that and to like see the woods in a different way, which is it's just a gift.
Yeah. Okay, last call for questions. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you do have any that come to you later, or even if you get to this fall and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do? Feel free to reach out. So
You guys are making this way too easy on us.
yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop the recording.